The Cursed Love Letter. Act 1. The letter arrives. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Eleanor Whitmore had been in the library most of the afternoon, lost among the leather-bound volumes that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Outside, London's perpetual fog pressed against the windows, turning the October day prematurely dark. She hadn't noticed the gradual dimming until Mrs. Winters, their housekeeper, entered with a lamp. "Miss Eleanor, you'll strain your eyes reading in such poor light," the older woman scolded gently, setting the lamp on the desk beside her. Eleanor looked up from her book, a collection of Byron's poetry, and blinked. "Is it evening already?" "Nearly so, and this came for you." Mrs. Winters extended a cream-coloured envelope on a small silver tray. Eleanor took it, noting the absence of postage or return address. "Who delivered this?" "Can't say, miss. It was simply on the doorstep when I went to bring in the milk." The envelope was of fine quality, sealed with dark red wax bearing no insignia. Her name was written across the front in an elegant flowing script that seemed both foreign and oddly familiar. Eleanor turned it over in her hands, a curious sensation settling in her chest, something between anticipation and unease. "Will there be anything else, miss?" "No, thank you, Mrs. Winters." When the housekeeper had gone, Eleanor broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, yellowed slightly at the edges as though aged. The same elegant handwriting filled the page. "My dearest Eleanor, time has been both cruel and kind. Cruel in keeping us apart, kind in preserving my devotion to you. I have searched through shadows and light, through centuries of longing, and at last I feel your presence once more in this world. Do you remember the promises we made beneath the willow? Do you recall how the moonlight caught in your hair as you laughed and placed your hand in mine? I remember every moment, every word, every breath. I have waited so long to find you again. The years have been empty without you, but I have never stopped searching, and now at last I sense you are near. I will come to you soon, my love. Look for me in the spaces between dreams and waking, in reflections and shadows. I am closer than you think, forever yours, until time itself ceases." Eleanor read the letter twice, then a third time, her heart beating faster with each reading. It was clearly a mistake. She had no suitor, no admirer who would write such passionate words. Yet something about the letter stirred a response deep within her, like the echo of a half-forgotten melody. "What nonsense," she murmured, attempting to dismiss the strange feeling. She placed the letter back in its envelope and slipped it into her book as a marker. That evening, Eleanor dined alone with her father, as was their custom. Charles Whitmore was a distant man who had grown more remote since her mother's death 5 years prior. He inquired about her day with polite disinterest, his attention focused primarily on the financial papers beside his plate. "I received a strange letter today," Eleanor said, breaking their usual silence. Her father glanced up briefly. "Oh? From whom?" "That's just it. It wasn't signed. It appears to be a love letter." Charles Whitmore's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "A love letter? From one of those university boys you met at the Harringtons last month, I suppose?" "No, it's nothing like that. The letter is unusual, almost as if the writer has confused me with someone else." Her father resumed eating. "Burn it. Anonymous letters are rarely proper and never appropriate for a young lady to entertain." Eleanor nodded, though she had no intention of destroying the letter. Something about it demanded further consideration. Later that night, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor found herself drawn to the letter again. She read it once more by candlelight, tracing the elegant script with her fingertip. The words seemed to shimmer on the page, almost alive beneath her touch. Sleep came slowly that night, and when it did, she dreamed. She stood beneath a massive willow tree, its branches swaying in a gentle breeze. She wore a dress of pale blue silk, far more elaborate than anything in her wardrobe. The air smelled of roses and something else, something older and earthier. Eleanor. She turned at the sound of her name. spoken in a voice that resonated through her very being. A man stood several paces away, his features obscured by shadow despite the bright moonlight that bathed the garden around them. "Who are you?" she asked, though some part of her already knew. "Don't you remember?" The sorrow in his voice was palpable. He took a step forward, and for a moment she caught a glimpse of his face, handsome with dark eyes that held centuries of longing. "I don't," she began, but the words died in her throat as he reached for her hand. Just before their fingers touched, he began to dissolve, becoming mist that swirled around her before dissipating into the night air. "Find me," his voice whispered, now seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Please, find me this time." Eleanor woke with a gasp, her heart racing. The dream had been so vivid, so real, that she could still smell the earthy scent of the garden. She lit her bedside lamp with trembling hands and reached for the letter, which she'd placed on her nightstand. The words remained unchanged, yet they seemed to hold new meaning after the dream. She ran her fingers over the signature line, until time itself ceases, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night. The next morning, Eleanor sought out her grandmother. Agatha Whitmore rarely left her rooms these days, preferring the company of her memories to that of the living. At 83, she was the oldest living Whitmore, and the keeper of the family's history. Eleanor found her by the window in her sitting room, wrapped in a shawl despite the fire burning in the grate. "Grandmother, may I speak with you?" Agatha turned, her roomy eyes brightening at the sight of her granddaughter. "Eleanor, dear, come sit with me." Eleanor settled into the chair opposite her grandmother and withdrew the letter from her pocket. "I received this yesterday. It's unusual." Agatha took the envelope, her gnarled fingers tracing the handwriting on the front. Before she even opened it, the colour drained from her face. "Grandmother, are you unwell?" The old woman didn't answer immediately. She opened the envelope with shaking hands and unfolded the letter. As she read, tears welled in her eyes. "So it begins again," she whispered. "What begins? Do you know who sent this?" Agatha refolded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. "I received the same letter when I was your age, as did my mother before me and her mother before her." Eleanor stared at her grandmother in disbelief. "The same letter? That's impossible. Not the same words, perhaps, but the same hand, the same presence." Agatha clutched Eleanor's wrist suddenly, her grip surprisingly strong. "You must burn it, child. Burn it and forget it ever came." "But who is he? The man who writes these letters?" Agatha's gaze drifted to the window, to the willow tree that stood at the far end of the garden. "His name was Theodore Hawthorne, a poet, a scholar, and something else, something darker." "Was? He died, or should have died, nearly 2 centuries ago. He was engaged to marry Margaret Whitmore, your great-great-grandmother." Eleanor felt a chill run through her. "And what happened to them?" "Margaret died young of a broken heart," they said. "Theodore vanished before their wedding day. Some said he fled, others that he practiced dark arts and met a terrible fate." Agatha's voice dropped to a whisper. "But he never truly left. Every generation he sends his letter to a Whitmore woman, and every woman who receives it suffers." "Suffers how?" "Love becomes their undoing. Some waste away pining for men who abandon them. Others marry only to lose their husbands to tragedy. Your own mother." Agatha stopped herself. "Mother died of influenza," Eleanor said firmly. "Yes, but the letter came to her first. I warned her just as I'm warning you." Agatha pressed the envelope back into Eleanor's hands. "Burn it, child, before it's too late." Eleanor left her grandmother's rooms with more questions than answers. The idea that the letter was part of some family curse seemed absurd, the product of an old woman's superstition. And yet the dream had felt so real, and her grandmother's fear had been genuine. That night, Eleanor stood before her bedroom fireplace, the letter in her hand. The sensible thing would be to follow her grandmother's advice and burn it. Yet something held her back, the same something that had stirred within her when she first read the words. Instead of casting it into the flames, she tucked it into her journal and placed it in her desk drawer. As she did, she caught a glimpse of movement in her dressing table mirror. She turned quickly, but her room was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, for just a moment, she thought she saw a man standing behind her reflection, the same shadowy figure from her dream. She spun around again, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. That night she dreamed of him again, and the night after. Each dream revealed a little more: a garden path, a whispered promise, the touch of his hand against her cheek. Each morning, she woke with the sense that she was remembering rather than dreaming, though the memories couldn't possibly be her own. Act 2. The mystery deepens. A week after the letter's arrival, Eleanor found herself drawn to it constantly. She carried it with her during the day, tucked into a pocket or between the pages of whatever book she was reading. At night, she placed it beneath her pillow, as though proximity to it might bring more dreams, more glimpses of the mysterious Theodore. The dreams did continue, growing more vivid with each passing night. In them, she wore Margaret's face but felt her own emotions. She walked through gardens that no longer existed and danced in ballrooms long since demolished. And always, Theodore was there, sometimes clear enough that she could count his eyelashes, other times just a presence at the edge of her vision. During her waking hours, Eleanor began to notice strange occurrences, glimpses of a tall figure in mirrors that vanished when she turned, the scent of sandalwood and ink, a scent she now associated with Theodore, appearing in empty rooms, books falling open to love poems she hadn't been reading. "You look tired, Miss Eleanor," Mrs. Winters commented one morning as she brought tea to the library. "Are you not sleeping well?" Eleanor looked up from the family history she'd been studying. "I'm sleeping quite deeply, actually. It's just my dreams have been unusually vivid." Mrs. Winters clucked her tongue. "It's this house. Too many draughts and creaks. Perhaps you should visit your cousin in Bath for a change of air." "Perhaps," Eleanor agreed absently, though she had no intention of leaving. Not when she felt so close to understanding the mystery of Theodore Hawthorne. Her research had yielded little so far. The family histories mentioned Margaret Whitmore only briefly, noting her engagement to a gentleman of letters and her untimely death at 23. Theodore's name appeared nowhere in the official records. That afternoon, Eleanor's father summoned her to his study. Charles Whitmore rarely sought her company, and his expression as she entered suggested this wasn't a social call. "Your grandmother tells me you received a letter," he said without preamble. "An anonymous letter that has been causing you some distress." "Not distress, father. Curiosity, perhaps." Charles frowned. "Curiosity is a dangerous quality in a young woman. I understand you've been asking questions about our family history, specifically about Margaret Whitmore." "Yes. I found it interesting that so little is recorded about her. Some matters are best left in the past." He straightened papers on his desk, a nervous habit Eleanor recognized from childhood. "I've arranged for you to visit your Aunt Beatrice in Cornwall. The sea air will do you good." Eleanor felt a flash of indignation. "I'm perfectly well, father, and I'm hardly a child to be sent away at the first sign of independent thought." "This is not about independent thought, Eleanor, it's about—" He hesitated. "Your grandmother has concerns I share. About a letter, or about the family secret no one will properly explain to me." Charles sighed heavily. "There are no secrets, only painful histories best forgotten. You'll leave for Cornwall on Friday." Eleanor left her father's study seething with frustration. She had no intention of going to Cornwall, but arguing further would only strengthen his resolve. Better to appear compliant while continuing her investigation. That night, her dream was different. She stood in a part of the house she didn't recognize, a long corridor with doors she'd never seen before. At the end of the hall, a figure beckoned to her. "This way," Theodore's voice called. "What you seek is here." She followed him through a door that opened onto a circular staircase. Up they went, climbing higher than seemed possible within the house she knew. Finally, They emerged into a dusty, abandoned room with a single window overlooking the willow tree. "This was my room," Theodore said, his voice clearer than in previous dreams. "When I was welcome here." "Your room? You lived in our house?" "I was tutor to Margaret's brother first, then her suitor, until they discovered my work." "What work?" Theodore moved to the window, his form more substantial than before. "Look beneath the floorboards, Eleanor. By the eastern wall. What was hidden remains." "I don't understand." "Find me," he said, beginning to fade as he always did, "before it's too late for both of us." Eleanor woke with a start, the early morning light filtering through her curtains. The dream had been so specific, so detailed, unlike the fragmentary visions of previous nights. She dressed quickly, not bothering to call for her lady's maid. The house was quiet as she made her way through the familiar corridors, trying to match them to the unfamiliar ones from her dream. The east wing had been closed off for decades, since before her birth, ostensibly due to structural concerns. Her father had always forbidden her from exploring it. The door to the east wing was locked, but Eleanor had come prepared. During her childhood explorations of the house, she had discovered a ring of skeleton keys in an old desk. She'd kept them hidden in her room ever since, though she'd never had reason to use them until now. The third key turned in the lock with a reluctant groan. Eleanor pushed the door open, wincing at the creak of hinges long unused. The corridor beyond was dark and thick with dust. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like tattered lace. She lit the candle she'd brought and stepped forward, her heart pounding. The corridor matched the one from her dream perfectly. At its end, she found the door that had opened onto the spiral staircase. This door too was locked, but yielded to another of her skeleton keys. The staircase beyond was narrow and steep, the steps worn in the centre from years of use. Eleanor climbed carefully, one hand holding her candle, the other trailing along the wall for balance. At the top, she found herself in a circular room, clearly once a bedroom, though long abandoned. A bed frame stood against one wall, its mattress and linens long since removed. A desk remained by the window, its surface thick with dust. And there, on the eastern wall, was a section of floorboard that looked slightly different from the rest. Eleanor knelt beside it, setting her candle on the floor. The board moved when she pressed on one end, revealing it wasn't nailed down like the others. She pried it up with trembling fingers. In the space beneath lay a leather-bound journal, remarkably well preserved despite its age. Eleanor lifted it carefully, brushing dust from its cover. There was no title, no name embossed on the leather. She opened it to the first page and gasped. The Personal Journal of Theodore Hawthorne, 1789. The handwriting matched the letter perfectly. Eleanor sank to the floor, her back against the wall, and began to read. April 15th, 1789. I have taken a position as tutor to young Master Whitmore. The family is wealthy and well-connected, the house grand if somewhat austere. The boy is bright enough, though more interested in hunting than Homer. Still, the position offers room, board, and a generous salary, more than enough to support my true work. April 30th, 1789. I met Miss Margaret Whitmore today. She interrupted our Latin lesson to retrieve a book from her brother's room. I have never seen such grace, such quiet intelligence in a young woman's eyes. She asked what we were reading, and when I told her, Ovid's Metamorphoses, she quoted a passage in perfect Latin. Her brother groaned that she was always showing off, but I was enchanted. May 18th, 1789. Margaret sought me out in the library today. She asked if I might recommend reading material more stimulating than the insipid novels her governess provides. I suggested several volumes of poetry and history. Our hands touched as I passed her a book of Donne's works. I felt it like lightning through my veins. The early entries chronicled Theodore's growing fascination with Margaret, their clandestine meetings in the library, their shared love of literature and ideas. By autumn of that year, they had fallen deeply in love, though they kept their feelings secret from her family. November 3rd, 1789. Margaret and I walked in the garden today, chaperoned by her distracted aunt, who remained engrossed in her needlework on a bench near the house. We ventured to the willow tree at the garden's edge, where I finally found the courage to declare my feelings. To my joy, she returned them with equal fervour. We shared our first kiss beneath those swaying branches, brief but sweeter than any poetry could describe. December 12th, 1789. I have asked Mr. Whitmore for Margaret's hand, revealing that we have formed an attachment. He was surprisingly receptive. My position as tutor apparently less important than my family connections and university education. We are to be married in the spring. I can scarcely believe my fortune. January 20th, 1790. The dreams continue to worsen. Each night I see Margaret's death in a different way. Illness, accident, childbirth. I wake in cold sweats, convinced these are premonitions. I cannot lose her. I will not. February 3rd, 1790. I have found references in an ancient text to a ritual that might bind our souls together beyond death. The ingredients are difficult to obtain, the process dangerous, but what wouldn't I risk? For eternal love? If something should happen to either of us, the ritual would ensure we find each other again, in this life or the next. Eleanor's hands trembled as she turned the pages. The entries grew darker, more obsessive. Theodore described obtaining rare herbs and artifacts, studying forbidden texts, performing increasingly complex rituals, all driven by his fear of losing Margaret. March 15th, 1790. The final component is ready. Tonight, under the full moon, I will complete the ritual. Margaret knows nothing of this. She would not understand my methods, though she would understand my devotion. When it is done, not even death will part us. Our souls will find each other through eternity. March 16th, 1790. Disaster. I was discovered. Mr. Whitmore found my ritual chamber and my texts. He called me demon, sorcerer, corrupter. He has forbidden me from seeing Margaret and threatened to have me arrested for witchcraft if I do not leave immediately. I tried to explain that my work was born of love, not darkness, but he would not listen. I leave at dawn, but I will not abandon Margaret. The ritual was incomplete, but perhaps enough was done. I will find a way back to her, in this life or another. The next entry was dated 3 months later, the handwriting more hurried, less controlled. June 21st, 1790. I have heard news that has shattered my heart. Margaret is ill, a wasting sickness the doctors cannot identify. I know the cause. Our incomplete bond is draining her life force. The ritual, half done, has become a curse rather than a blessing. I must return to complete it properly, though it means risking my life. I have written to her, telling her to meet me beneath the willow at midnight on Midsummer's Eve. Together we will finish what I started and break this accidental curse. The final entry was brief, the ink blotched as though written in haste, or through tears. June 24th, 1790. I am undone. I returned to the Whitmore estate as planned, but Margaret did not come to the willow. I learned from a sympathetic servant that she died yesterday. My letter arrived too late. The ritual has trapped me in a half state, neither fully alive nor dead. I feel myself fading from this world, yet unable to pass to the next. I am bound to Margaret's soul, but she has moved beyond my reach. I will find her again. If it takes centuries, I will find her when her soul returns. I will write to her, call to her, until she remembers and helps me complete the ritual that will free us both. I will return to her, in time, even if it takes eternity. The journal ended there. Eleanor closed it, her mind reeling with the implications. If Theodore's account was true, then the letter she'd received wasn't merely a family curse. It was a desperate plea from a soul trapped between worlds for nearly a century. And she, or some part of her, was Margaret, returned as Theodore had hoped. The sound of the house awakening reached her even in this abandoned tower room. She needed to return to her chambers before she was missed. Clutching the journal to her chest, Eleanor made her way back down the spiral staircase and through the dusty corridor. She had just locked the door to the east wing when a voice startled her. "Miss Eleanor, what are you doing in this part of the house?" She turned to find Mrs. Winters regarding her with suspicion. I thought I heard noises, Eleanor improvised, hiding the journal behind her skirts. A rat, perhaps, but it was nothing. This wing is unsafe, miss. Your father would be most displeased to find you here. Yes, of course, I was just leaving. Eleanor hurried to her room, her mind racing with all she had learned. She hid the journal beneath her mattress and went down to breakfast, trying to appear normal despite the extraordinary knowledge she now possessed. Over the next few days, Eleanor read and reread Theodore's journal, searching for clues about the ritual he had attempted and how it might be completed or undone. The entries were frustratingly vague about the specific components, as though Theodore had deliberately obscured the details in case the journal was discovered. Meanwhile, Theodore's presence grew stronger. Eleanor saw him more clearly now, in mirrors, in shadows, sometimes standing at the foot of her bed when she woke in the night. He never spoke outside of dreams, but his eyes conveyed a desperate longing that matched the words in his journal. Her father noticed the change in her behaviour. You seem distracted, Eleanor, he commented over dinner one evening. Are you ill? No, father, just preoccupied with my reading. Ah, yes, your reading. His tone suggested disapproval. Your trunk is packed for Cornwall. We leave tomorrow morning. Eleanor set down her fork. Father, I've been thinking. I'm 22 years old, hardly a child to be sent away when I show an interest in our family history. This isn't about family history, isn't it? About Margaret Whitmore and Theodore Hawthorne? Charles Whitmore's face paled. Where did you hear that name? I found his journal. I know about the ritual, about what happened to them. Her father's hand trembled as he reached for his wineglass. Fairy tales and superstition. Is it? Then why has every Whitmore woman who received his letter suffered in love? Why did grandmother warn me so desperately? Why are you sending me away? Because I watched your mother waste away after she received that damned letter. Charles slammed his hand on the table, his composure finally breaking. She became obsessed, just as you are becoming. She saw him in mirrors, heard him calling to her. The doctors called it nervous hysteria, but I knew it was that cursed spirit stealing her vitality just as it stole Margaret's. Eleanor stared at her father, shocked by his outburst. Mother died of influenza. The influenza took her because she was already weakened. By him. Charles's voice broke. I will not lose you the same way. Father, please listen. Theodore isn't trying to harm anyone. He's trapped, caught between worlds because of a ritual gone wrong. He's trying to break the curse, not perpetuate it. And you believe the words of a sorcerer who's been dead for a century? I believe he loved Margaret, and still does. I believe he's suffering. Charles shook his head. We leave for Cornwall tomorrow. This discussion is finished. That night, Eleanor dreamed more vividly than ever before. She stood beneath the willow tree, wearing a white dress that gleamed in the moonlight. Theodore stood before her, more solid than she had ever seen him, his dark eyes filled with a century of longing. You found my journal, he said, taking her hands in his. They felt real, warm and solid against her skin. Yes, but it doesn't explain how to complete the ritual, how to free you. The final page, hidden in the binding. I concealed it there in case the journal was discovered. Tell me what to do, Eleanor pleaded, before they send me away. Theodore's form flickered slightly like a candle in a draught. The letter must be burned at midnight beneath the willow where our love first blossomed. But Eleanor, his expression grew grave. There is risk. If the ritual succeeds, I will be freed from this half-existence, but all memory of me will be erased from the world. My words, my name, all will vanish as though I never existed. And if it fails? Then the cycle continues. Another generation, another letter. And I remain trapped, watching you live and die again and again. Eleanor felt tears on her cheeks. I'll do it. Tonight. Theodore pulled her close, his lips brushing her forehead. My brave Margaret, my beloved Eleanor. Eleanor woke with fierce determination. She would not go to Cornwall. She would end Theodore's suffering tonight. She retrieved the journal from beneath her mattress and carefully examined the binding. There, tucked into the spine, was a folded piece of parchment she hadn't noticed before. She eased it out and unfolded it with trembling fingers. The page contained detailed instructions for the ritual: herbs to be burned, words to be spoken, actions to be taken precisely at midnight. At the bottom was a warning. The one who performs this ritual must have the blood of Margaret Whitmore in their veins and love in their heart. Without both, the attempt will fail, and the curse will strengthen. Eleanor had the blood. She was Margaret's direct descendant. But love? She had never met Theodore in life, only in dreams and visions. Yet when she thought of him, her heart ached with a longing that felt ancient and familiar. Was it Margaret's love she felt, or her own? Did it matter? She spent the day preparing, gathering the herbs listed in the instructions: rosemary, thyme, lavender, from the kitchen garden. She found a silver bowl in the dining room cabinet and secreted it to her room. When night fell, she waited until the house grew quiet before slipping out into the garden. The October night was cold, the grass frosted beneath her slippers. Eleanor made her way to the willow tree, its bare branches swaying gently in the breeze. She spread her cloak on the ground and arranged the components of the ritual as instructed. The pocket watch she'd borrowed from her father's study showed 11:55, almost midnight, almost time. "Eleanor!" She turned to see her father striding across the lawn, his face a mask of fury and fear. "Go back inside, father, please. I will not let you do this, whatever madness." "Yes, you're planning. It's not madness. It's mercy." Eleanor stood her ground. "He's been trapped for over a century, suffering. I can free him." Charles reached for her arm. "You're coming inside now." "No." Eleanor pulled away. "I have to do this." As they argued, the pocket watch ticked closer to midnight. Eleanor could feel Theodore's presence growing stronger, the air around the willow tree becoming charged with energy. "Please, father, trust me." Something in her voice, perhaps the echo of her mother or of Margaret, made Charles hesitate. In that moment of hesitation, the watch chimed midnight. Eleanor quickly placed the letter in the silver bowl and set it alight with a match. As the flames consumed the parchment, she recited the words from the hidden page. "Bound by love, divided by time, I release you from between worlds. By blood and fire, by moon and memory, I set you free." The flames in the bowl turned from orange to blue, then to a brilliant white that illuminated the garden like daylight. Within that light, Theodore appeared, not as a ghost or shadow, but as solid as any living man. He stepped toward Eleanor, his eyes filled with wonder and gratitude. "Margaret," he whispered. "Eleanor. Theodore." She reached for him, and this time their hands met. His touch was warm, real. "You freed me," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "After all this time." "Is the curse broken?" Charles asked, his anger replaced by awe at the spectacle before him. "Yes," Theodore answered, though his eyes never left Eleanor's face. "The incomplete ritual is finished. The cycle ends tonight." Eleanor felt tears on her cheeks. "Will I remember you?" "No one will. My existence will be erased from memory, from history." Theodore's smile was bittersweet. "But know that I loved you, in every lifetime, in every incarnation, and I thank you for this final gift of freedom." He leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers, a first and final kiss. As their lips met, the brilliant light surrounding them intensified, becoming almost blinding. "Thank you, my love," Theodore whispered against her lips. "You have freed me at last." The light flared once more, then vanished, taking Theodore with it. The garden was suddenly dark and still, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Eleanor stood frozen, a single tear tracking down her cheek, though she couldn't have explained why she was crying. The silver bowl at her feet contained only ashes, though she had no memory of burning anything. "Eleanor?" Her father's voice was gentle, confused. "What are we doing out here in the middle of the night?" She turned to him, blinking. I'm not sure. I felt drawn to the willow tree, but I can't remember why." Charles put his arm around her shoulders. "Come inside. It's freezing out here." As they walked back to the house, Eleanor felt a strange sense of peace washing over her, as though a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had been lifted. She glanced back once at the willow tree, its branches swaying in the night breeze. For just a moment she thought she saw two figures standing beneath it, a young woman in a pale blue dress and a tall man with dark eyes. Then the vision was gone, leaving only the ancient tree standing sentinel in the moonlight. Epilogue. The next morning Eleanor woke feeling oddly light, as though she'd been relieved of some great burden. She dressed and went to her desk, intending to write in her journal as she did each morning. When she opened the drawer, she found a leather-bound book she didn't recognize. Opening it, she discovered every page was blank, though the paper appeared aged. She ran her fingers over the cover, feeling an inexplicable sense of loss. "How strange," she murmured, setting the empty journal aside. At breakfast her father seemed different, less stern, more present. He asked about her plans for the day with genuine interest. "I thought I might read in the garden," she said. "The weather has turned quite mild." "A fine idea. Perhaps I'll join you later." Charles hesitated. "I've been thinking, Eleanor. You're a grown woman now, with a fine mind. Perhaps it's time I took you more seriously." Eleanor smiled, surprised and pleased by this change. "I'd like that very much." Later, as she sat beneath the willow tree with a volume of poetry, Eleanor felt a curious sensation, like a memory trying to surface. She looked up at the swaying branches and for just a moment thought she heard a whisper on the breeze. "Thank you, my love." A single tear rolled down her cheek, though she couldn't have explained why. She brushed it away and returned to her book, the strange moment passing like a dream upon waking. In the months that followed, the Whitmore household changed subtly but significantly. Charles emerged from his shell of grief, becoming the father Eleanor had needed for so long. Agatha seemed lighter somehow, the burden of family secrets lifted from her shoulders, though if asked, she couldn't have named what secrets those might have been. And Eleanor? She flourished in this new atmosphere of openness and trust. The following spring, she met a young professor of literature at a university lecture, a man with kind eyes and a passion for poetry that matched her own. When he proposed 6 months later, beneath the willow tree in the garden, she accepted with a full and joyful heart. On her wedding day, as she prepared in her childhood bedroom, Eleanor found herself drawn to the window overlooking the garden. The willow tree stood in full summer glory, its branches creating a green canopy over the spot where her fiancé had proposed. For just a moment she thought she saw two figures standing beneath it, transparent as mist, yet somehow more real than anything around them. They stood with hands clasped, watching the house. The woman turned, seeming to look directly at Eleanor, and smiled, a smile of such joy and peace that Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. The woman raised her hand in a gesture of farewell, and the man beside her did the same. Then, like morning mist touched by sunlight, they dissolved into the air, leaving only the swaying willow branches. "Miss Eleanor?" Her lady's maid entered, carrying the wedding veil. "It's nearly time." Eleanor turned from the window, wiping away an inexplicable tear. "Yes, of course." As the maid arranged the veil over her carefully styled hair, Eleanor caught her own reflection in the mirror. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw another face superimposed over hers, a woman with similar features but from another time. Then it was gone, leaving only her own reflection, flushed with happiness and anticipation. "You look beautiful, miss," the maid said, stepping back to admire her work. "Thank you, Mary." Eleanor smoothed her hands over the ivory silk of her gown. "I feel complete somehow." The wedding was everything Eleanor had hoped for, intimate yet joyful, with her father beaming proudly as he walked her down the aisle. When she and her new husband exchanged vows beneath an archway of flowers, Eleanor felt a sense of rightness that went beyond the moment, as though this marriage was somehow fulfilling a promise made long ago. That evening, as they departed for their honeymoon, Eleanor cast one last glance at the willow tree. In the gathering dusk it stood serene and ordinary, its branches stirring gently in the evening breeze. Yet she felt a connection to it she couldn't explain, a sense that it had witnessed something important, something that had shaped her life in ways she would never fully understand. "Ready to go, Mrs. Harrison?" her husband asked, offering his hand to help her into the carriage. Eleanor smiled and took his hand. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." As the carriage pulled away from Whitmore House, Eleanor felt no regret at leaving, only a quiet certainty that she was moving forward exactly as she should. The past, whatever it might have held, was at peace, and her future stretched before her, full of promise. Years later, when Eleanor's daughter was born, she felt drawn to name her Margaret, though she couldn't say why the name felt so significant. When the child was old enough to play in the garden during their visits to Whitmore House, Eleanor watched with inexplicable emotion as the little girl ran beneath the willow tree, laughing as its branches swayed around her. "She loves that old tree as much as you always did," her father commented, standing beside her on the terrace. "Did I?" Eleanor asked, surprised. "I don't remember being particularly attached to it." Charles looked puzzled for a moment. "Perhaps I'm mistaken. Memory plays strange tricks as one ages." Eleanor nodded, watching as her daughter spun in circles beneath the willow, arms outstretched as though dancing with an invisible partner. For just a moment she thought she saw golden light shimmering around the child, not alarming but protective, like a blessing. Then it was gone, and there was only Margaret, breathless with laughter, calling for her mother to come and see the heart she'd found carved into the willow's trunk. Eleanor crossed the lawn and knelt beside her daughter, examining the faded carving. 2 sets of initials were enclosed within the heart, so weathered by time that they were barely legible. "What does it say, Mamma?" Margaret asked, tracing the carving with her small finger. Eleanor squinted, making out what might have been an M and a T, though she couldn't be certain. "I'm not sure, darling. It's very old." "I think it's a love story," Margaret declared with the certainty of childhood, "like in your books." Eleanor smiled and brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Perhaps you're right." That night, Eleanor dreamed of the willow tree. In her dream it was younger, its branches less gnarled. A man and woman stood beneath it, their faces indistinct but their postures suggesting deep affection. They carved something into the trunk, laughing together as they worked. When Eleanor woke, the dream faded quickly, leaving only a lingering sense of contentment. She rolled over to find her husband watching her, his eyes warm with affection. "You were smiling in your sleep," he said, brushing his fingers along her cheek. "Was I? I was dreaming about the willow tree, I think." "The one at your father's house. What about it?" Eleanor tried to recall the details, but they slipped away like water through her fingers. "I'm not sure anymore, but it was a happy dream." Her husband pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I'm glad. You deserve only happy dreams." As the years passed, Eleanor's life unfolded with the natural rhythm of joy and sorrow that marks any human existence. She bore 2 more children after Margaret. She mourned her grandmother's passing and later her father's. She watched her children grow, marry, and have children of their own. Through it all she maintained a curious attachment to the willow tree, though she never quite understood why. When she inherited Whitmore House after her father's death, her first act was to ensure the tree would be preserved, regardless of any future changes to the property. "It's just a tree," her husband said gently when she insisted on including specific provisions for its care in her will. "I know," Eleanor replied, unable to explain even to herself why it mattered so much. "But it feels important somehow." On her 70th birthday, Eleanor sat beneath the willow, enjoying the summer afternoon. Her grandchildren played nearby, their laughter carrying on the breeze. She leaned back against the trunk, feeling the rough bark through her light summer dress, and closed her eyes. A sense of peace washed over her, deeper and more profound than anything she'd experienced before. For a moment she thought she heard music, faint and sweet like a distant waltz, and voices, a man and woman speaking too softly for her to make out the words, but the tone suggested joy, reunion, completion. Eleanor opened her eyes, expecting to see someone nearby, but she was alone beneath the tree. Yet the feeling of presence remained, not frightening but comforting, like old friends watching over her. "Grandmother!" Her eldest granddaughter approached, carrying a book. "Will you read to us?" Eleanor smiled and patted the grass beside her. "Of course, my dear." As the children gathered around, Eleanor opened the book of poetry her granddaughter had brought, a collection of romantic verses from the late 18th century. She began to read, her voice strong despite her years. The poems spoke of eternal love, of souls finding each other across time and space, of promises kept despite impossible odds. The words resonated within her, stirring emotions she couldn't name. When she finished reading, she looked up to find her grandchildren watching her with rapt attention. "That was beautiful, grandmother," her granddaughter said. "Do you believe love can last forever like in the poems?" Eleanor glanced up at the willow branches swaying gently above them. For a heartbeat she thought she saw two figures standing among them, transparent as gossamer but radiating joy. Then they were gone, leaving only dappled sunlight and shadow. "Yes," she said softly, "I believe some loves are eternal, even when we don't remember why." That evening, as twilight settled over the garden, Eleanor returned to the willow tree alone. She placed her hand against its trunk, feeling the rough bark beneath her palm and the faint indentation where the heart had been carved so long ago. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was thanking, or for what. A gentle breeze stirred the branches above her, sending a shower of leaves spiraling down around her like golden rain. One leaf, perfectly heart-shaped, landed on her outstretched hand. Eleanor smiled and tucked it into her book of poetry before turning back toward the house, where her family waited. As she walked away, she felt a profound sense of completion, as though a story that had begun long before her birth had finally reached its proper ending. Behind her, in the deepening twilight, two transparent figures watched her go, a handsome man in 18th century attire and a young woman whose face bore a striking resemblance to Eleanor's. They stood with hands clasped, free at last from the cycle that had bound them for generations. "She lived the life we never could," Margaret whispered. "And broke the curse that held us both," Theodore replied. "Our love found its way in the end." As the last light faded from the sky, they shared one final kiss beneath the willow tree. Then, like stars dissolving into dawn, they faded from this world completely, not into darkness, but into light. The curse was broken. The love letter had served its purpose, and somewhere beyond time and memory, two souls that had searched for each other across centuries finally found their way home. The end.